Hello and welcome back to another one of our midweek with Double Creek. Today, right now, we're in week 15, as you can see up here, out of our 52 weeks, in our 52 weeks with Jesus from the book by James Merritt. So we're moving right along here in this series. We are still in section 3. We're about halfway through this. And as I've said, this section is all about Jesus, the miracle worker. So each week during this section, we are looking at Jesus, obviously throughout this whole series, but in this section we are looking at Jesus and some of the miracles that he has performed. So we've kind of looked at Jesus changing the water into wine. We've looked at the miracle where Jesus calmed the sea. Last week we looked at the miracle where Jesus fed thousands of people from a small lunch. And today we're going to be looking at a leader worth following. Now, typically each week at this time I ask, what miracle? Since you know we're looking at a miracle of Jesus and you see this title, a leader worth following, I ask, what miracle do you think we're looking at today? And I'll be honest, you can go ahead and be thinking to yourself. You can say whatever you think it might be. This one's a little tougher than the others. But today we are looking at, we're going to focus on Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and it's the miracle where Jesus heals the centurion's servant. So, as we've been doing each week, I want to read this miracle here, these 10 verses as we start off. It says, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And then those who had been sent returned to the house. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. I just noticed it's kind of difficult to see the words on this screen. I'm going to have to change this up for the rest of maybe the series and make this screen a little bit darker right here and change how this looks a little bit, because I see on there it's difficult to read. It's easy to read here when you're in person, so I know that's difficult, but it was Luke 7 verses 1 through 10. So once again, this is another fascinating miracle that is performed by Jesus. So far in this miracles, what we've seen Jesus do, we have seen Jesus perform miracles where he was right there on the location where he performed the miracle. But this time, Jesus performs this miracle without being there, without even seeing the man. It's one of those miracles that wasn't seen by a large crowd of people, like last week's, obviously, with the feeding of the 5,000 or 5,000 plus and plus more. So it wasn't done in front of a large crowd, but no doubt news spread about this miracle fast, just like all the others. And the miracle was performed in this way because of how great a faith the centurion had. So what was a centurion? Many of you probably know what a centurion is. And basically, in simple terms today, a centurion was a Roman officer who was in charge of 100 soldiers. So a centurion had a pretty big responsibility. And so with him being a Roman soldier, it means that he wasn't Jewish, But he was living in Israel because at that time, as you know, Rome had control over the area. And every centurion had at least one servant. Most of them had more, plenty more. And that's where this centurion comes into play here in this story. And this servant that became sick, he was sick almost to the point of death. He was in a bad way. This servant was highly valued by this centurion. This centurion thought a lot of this servant. So that tells you what kind of man this servant was. So let's jump right into this and see what lessons today we can get from this miraculous story, because we're going to be learning today about kind of leading and following, being a leader and a follower a little bit. First thing Merritt points out in this chapter is the leader who follows. Merritt points out that there are only 2 times in the Bible where Jesus was like amazed or marveled at something. And both of them, to one degree or another, have to deal with relationships or leaderships. Deal with leadership. It is often a misunderstood word, I think, by many people. A lot of people think that just being in some authoritative position, just being in a certain position of power, makes you a leader. But I want to say that it's not the position that makes you a leader, it's the person that makes you a leader. See, it's how we live, it's how we treat people that makes us leaders. We can be sitting in any seat of power that we want to out there, but it doesn't mean we are true leaders. And so Merritt gives us, I think, some great advice here in this chapter about being leaders and about being followers. So the question is this, for us today, think about this. Do you consider yourself a leader? And think about the things we're going to be looking at. Think about that question as we go through our midweek time here together today. Do you consider yourself a leader? Because when you think about it, as adults, we should all be leaders in one way or another. Mothers can be leaders of children. Husbands can lead their families. Managers should lead their employees. The list goes on and on and on, all the way down to presidents and other national and world leaders. But it's not just for adults, right? Even a child can be a leader. They can be a leader for another child, for siblings, for other people around there, whether they're peers or whether they're a little bit younger than them. In Mark chapter 6, it opens up by telling the story about Jesus returning to his hometown with his disciples. He's teaching in the synagogues, and the Bible tells us that many people who heard him teaching in the synagogue in his hometown, they were astonished because they knew who Jesus was. He was the carpenter. He was the son of Mary and Joseph. He had brothers. And so they knew Jesus, but there were some things they just couldn't understand now about Jesus. They could not understand where this wisdom came from that he was teaching. How did he know all this? Where did it even come from? They didn't have that opportunity. They didn't know it, and they grew up in the same area. They also couldn't understand how it was that he was able to perform all these different miracles he was doing. All these things he was doing, healing people and doing this and doing that, and the way he taught, it was blowing their minds. They were astonished. And so this is where Jesus makes a well-known statement for people in the church. In Mark 6:4, Jesus said, it says, "And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And then in the 6th verse, 2 verses later, we read this, "And he marveled because of their unbelief." Even though Jesus, even though he was performing all these miracles, even though he was teaching the way he was in ways they had never even heard, and they didn't understand how he was able to do all these things, they didn't believe in him as the Messiah. Not just the people in his hometown, but even his brothers. And Jesus is kind of amazed. He's marveled here, it says, because of their unbelief. It's like he's thinking, how in the world can they see all of these things? How in the world can they see all these miracles, hear what I'm saying and still not believe. See, they were people who had grown up with Jesus. They were people who had known Jesus his entire life. And yet they still didn't want Jesus to lead them. The other time where Merritt points out where Jesus was either amazed or marveled at something was in the story I read earlier. He was marveled, he was amazed at the faith that the centurion had. The man who just said, listen, just say the word and my servant is going to be healed. This was a man, as I said earlier, who was a Roman officer. So most likely he was not very religious. At least he wasn't religious in the way we think of religion. He wasn't religious in the way that he worshiped the one true living God. You know, he most likely, it's highly unlikely that he was a scholar of the Old Testament scriptures. And so it's amazing here to see the faith that he had. But it wasn't just that he believed, it was how he believed. He understood, I think, something that was really a key principle in Jesus' leadership philosophy. And that is that the way to lead is to learn how to follow, to learn how to hand something over to someone else. If we've never followed someone who's a great leader, if we've never followed someone else's leadership before, then it becomes difficult for us to be leaders ourselves. Because leaders learn to follow first. And the next thing Merritt talks about in this chapter is under authority. As we've already seen in this story, this centurion had a sick servant, someone he thought highly of. And this centurion, he had obviously, as it says, he had heard about Jesus. He had obviously heard about the miracles that he was doing, all the things that he was able to perform. He probably doesn't understand who Jesus really is. But whether he does or not, and I'm confident that he didn't, he knows for certain that Jesus can heal his servant, and he knows for certain that Jesus is the one that he needs to turn to. So what does he do? He doesn't go to Jesus himself. He sends some Jewish elders to Jesus. He sends some of Jesus' own people to Jesus to ask Jesus to heal his servant. Now the passage tells us they come upon Jesus and that they pleaded earnestly with Jesus. They even tell Jesus that, hey, this servant loves the nation of Israel. In fact, they said he is the one who built their synagogue. And then Jesus chooses what? He chooses to go with them. And as they're going along, they're getting closer and closer to the centurion's house. They're not far from that house when the centurion sends out some friends to tell Jesus. He says, listen, you don't need to come this way anymore. You don't need to come any further. He also adds that I'm not worthy to even have you come under my house. He knows that all Jesus has to do is say the word and his servant would be healed. That's a great deal of faith, isn't it? He knows in his heart that Jesus doesn't even have to move a muscle. He can just speak and it would be done. Strong faith like that, it's hard to find. And then to prove really that he understood really what leadership is, and in the eyes of Jesus, he continues on. He then begins to talk to Jesus about his position of authority himself. He points out, listen, I'm also a man under authority. He says, and I have soldiers. And I can tell this one to go, and he goes. I can tell this one over here to come, and he does it. He comes. They do whatever I tell them to do. He's pointing out to Jesus, listen, I know what leadership is, but we see his real leadership when he sends for Jesus. Sure, this man, he can command 100 Roman soldiers. But when he finally understands here that he has to rely on someone else, and in this case, Jesus, I think that's when we really see what type of leader he is. Because leadership is not just about being over people. That's not it at all. Leadership is about caring for people. And to do so, you have to realize sometimes whose authority it is you're under. And to understand authority, we need to understand the pecking order. Do you know where the term pecking order originated from? When you think of pecking, maybe you think of chickens, something like that, and that's a good thought. Because the term pecking order, it originated with Norwegian scientists while they were studying hens. And most people, when they first hear this, they assume that it deals with food. They maybe assume that it deals with the strongest hen gets to eat first, the weakest hen eats last, you come on down the line. But the pecking order isn't about food, but it's about each other. And so what the scientists did is they began to count how often these chickens pecked each other. And so by counting the number of times that chickens gave and received pecks, the scientists then learned the chain of command. So the alpha bird, the top dog, did the most pecking, while the omega, the one who did the least, was last. They got pecked the most. The rest of the chickens, they fell somewhere in between those two in the pecking order. So that's where the term pecking order originated from. But if you think about it, God has built a pecking order in the form of life ever since creation. Just think about how this world runs at all types of levels. You know, in every country, there is a pecking order between its government and the citizens. Romans 13:1, it says this, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now, clearly in America, with our system and the way it works, we have people typically who are voted into positions who make decisions for local positions, for states, and for our nation. And it's a similar pecking order to what other nations might have as well. Not every nation, obviously, they're different, but what many other nations have. But God also places like a pecking order in the home. In Ephesians chapter 5, we read that the husband is to lead the wife. In Ephesians 6, we read really that the parents are to lead their children. And just think about how life works in general. From the time that we are born, from newborns and infants and through childhood and everything, from the time that we are born, the first lesson that God wants us to learn is not how to lead, it's how to follow. We learn very early on as children to follow older people. Our parents, our grandparents, a babysitter, our preschool teachers, our older siblings. See, the first lesson we learn in life is really about being followers. And as we go through this process of leadership, we then see that we have to respect leadership. This is something that is kind of, we're losing. We're losing this in our society. And I think it's clear to all of you all who are hearing this that in the last few decades, I would say at least the last few decades, America has experienced a cultural and a moral breakdown in many different ways. And I think one of the keys, if not the key driving force behind that, is the lack of respect for leaders. And I think the main two places where respect has been lost is in the home and in the schools. Children sometimes are very disrespectful to their parents. And likewise, it becomes very difficult to teach in school systems sometimes because there's little respect for teachers by students and even by their parents at times. Now, wouldn't it be great if our culture took a page out of how the disciples learned from Jesus, how to be leaders? In Mark chapter 1, Jesus was passing beside that Sea of Galilee, which we've talked about a couple different times here now in this series already. and he saw Simon and his brother Andrew fishing. And this is what verse 17 says. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Think about those words. Because you could also put it like this. Jesus could have just said, "If you let me teach you how to follow me, you will then learn how to lead." It's certainly not a coincidence that most of his disciples went on to become the first leaders in the early church. Because for 3+ years they did nothing but follow Jesus. And in learning how to follow and watching a great leader, they learned how to lead. This is why fathers need to learn to follow Christ. It's been said that there are a lot of kids out there that they don't follow their father's leadership because their father does not follow Christ's leadership, or they don't become a Christian. These children don't sometimes because their fathers never became a Christian. See, we can't lead if we don't first know how to be a great follower. Many youth in our world, they struggle. It's difficult for kids in our world nowadays. There's so much going on. There's so many distractions, so many things to pull them away from God, so much more than even just when I grew up. So they struggle. They become depressed. They have trouble in relationships. They have trouble in life. And much of that is just because they were never taught, they were never led in the right way that they should go. And it's become the same way often with students in schools. There are students who don't have teachers who are very good leaders, and it's the way it is. They don't lead them in the right way. Or they've learned at home that they don't have to respect their teachers. They don't have to follow that leadership. You know, when we were kids, it wasn't a game, I'll say it's a game, but we used to do or play follow the leader, and you all know what that is. If we were going to another classroom, and this is like elementary age obviously, or preschool even, but if we were going to another classroom or to lunch or to the library or to PE or wherever we were going, the teacher would pick one person to be at the front of the line, and they would be the leader. The rest of us would follow that person who was the leader. But the leader would take us in the right way. The leader would take us where we needed to go. Because a good leader will take you the right way. And when we have great leaders to follow, it's easy to respect that leadership. And then finally, the last thing Merritt talks about in this chapter is receiving leadership. Back to the story here quickly as we get ready to finish up. Back to the story here quickly of the centurion and the servant. When Jesus heard about the faith that the centurion had, he marveled at what strong faith he had, and he healed his servant. When you think about it, Jesus performed this miracle for some Gentile stranger, not some Jewish person. You know, he had a difficult time performing miracles for Jewish people, often because they didn't believe, they didn't have the faith like this centurion had. Even Jesus, throughout his life, he followed the principle of leading by following. You know, you can't see these verses up here, but I'm getting ready to show you, but you're going to know what they are, or you can't see them very well. In Luke chapter 2, we read about the time where, you can read about the time where, it's a long chapter, but near the end of it, you can read about the time where Jesus and his parents, they were in Jerusalem. The parents left, and they thought Jesus was with them, but Jesus stayed back in Jerusalem. They didn't realize it. When they finally found him and they began to head back, this is what we read in verse 51. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. He was submissive. Jesus. He was submissive to them. In John 6:38, we see where Jesus followed his Father and what his Father wanted. Jesus said, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." In Matthew 4:1, we can see where Jesus followed or was led by the Spirit. It says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." So what you really see here in Jesus is he follows that example of leading by following. He was obviously the greatest leader of all time, but he also learned to follow people as well. It's that pecking order, really, that God first set in motion at the beginning of creation. First, you learn to follow great leaders. And then you know how to lead. And so as we finish up, the church here in America would be revolutionized. It would take a major change if Christians were willing to learn how to follow. I think there would be a great revival in the church across this country if the people in the church, if those people who are Christians in the church, the members of the church, if they were all willing to serve when called on by leaders of that church, or if they would just gladly give of themselves generously. Leadership in the church, it's all about learning how to follow the leadership of Christ, because he is the ultimate leader. If we can follow Jesus, we will be effective leaders, because he is a leader worth following. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you're watching this right now on Wednesday night at our church, since I'm not there, if you have any, you can turn this off, and if you have any comments, you guys can talk amongst yourselves, and then close with the word of prayer. For anyone else, I'm just going to close this with the word of prayer, and we'll log on. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, God. I thank you for your many blessings. Father, I thank you for the fact that we are able to still meet together in this way. It's not typical. It's unusual. It's not the way we prefer doing things, Father, but it's so wonderful that we can still be able to get together in a different way, Father, and still be able to just fellowship and be in your word. Father, I pray that you would just bless all these people who are here tonight, who are watching this, Father. And Father, I just pray that you would just lead us and guide us. Pray this in your Son's name. Amen.